This legislation aims at halting biodiversity loss worldwide. The ecosystem service approach has the potential to enhance the ecological and societal relevance of environmental risk assessment and environmental risk management of regulated stressors. To be applied by policymakers, it should consider the nature contribution to human well-being, as well as protecting biodiversity and safeguard the sustainability of ecosystem. This is a demanding task, as you can imagine, and we will explore in the next hours how the ecosystem service approach can help reaching these goals and which challenges can be encountered in the practical work and how we might overcome them. So I would like to invite our first speaker, which is Professor Libet Brossard, soil biology at Wageningen University. His specific interest is how the use of ecosystem service approach can inform land use planning and decision-making in agricultural landscape. The talk has the title, The Elusive Link Between Biodiversity, Multifunctionality and Ecosystem Services. Libert, the floor is yours, or Libert, I think is right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thanks to the organizers of this session for inviting me. Let me admit up front that my expertise in environmental risk assessment does not go beyond a few co-authorships with more knowledgeable people. So you may be surprised to see me here, and frankly, so am I. But the reason I was asked to speak here was that the organizers wanted an introductory talk on the state of the art on biodiversity and ecosystem services in general. Now that is a daunting task, of course, and let's see where we get. I gave my talk the title, The Elusive Links Between Biodiversity, Multifunctionality and Ecosystem Services. And here is the table of contents. First, what are ecosystem services about? Then, what is multifunctionality about? What is biodiversity about, for that matter? Then I'll spend a few words on ecosystem services as a boundary concept, and finally I'll come back to the term elusive in the title. So first of all, what are ecosystem services about? Ecosystem services have been defined as the benefits humans derive from nature. And as you can see, this definition is already 20 years old and still serves us well. Although more recently, another definition has been proposed, and that is nature's contributions to people. And I only mention this because the publication where it was mentioned contains a very nice table on what they call nature's contributions to people, but what I, for practical purposes, will still call ecosystem services. And Marie Stenzeke later in this session will dwell upon the nature contributions to people concept. So here is the list of 18 ecosystem services that are mentioned in that paper. And I marked a few in yellow as being of particular interest to our session today, and I won't mention them all, but for example, you see here, pollination and dispersal of seeds and other propagules, and regulation of detrimental organisms and biological processes. So far about ecosystem services. Of course, I come back to the subject later. Then, what is multifunctionality about? And to explain that, I use this figure. It is derived from a publication on freshwater ecology and riparian forest ecosystems. I won't go into the details of that paper. I just borrow this nice picture for the purpose of my talk. And what you can see here is that in an ecosystem at the landscape level, you will have environmental conditions which shape the community of species, which are responsible for ecological processes in the system and which provide ecosystem services. And I'll come back to the middle part of this figure later. Now, multifunctionality simply is the the multiplicity of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services often go together. They may also exclude each other, but this is what is meant with multifunctionality. Now, ecosystem services are the result of the functioning of ecosystems, that is, ecosystem processes. And ecosystem processes, they, like element cycling and water cycling, they also go together. So there is ecosystem process multifunctionality underlying ecosystem service multifunctionality. I will now move to the question, what is biodiversity about? Well, in this figure, you see an array of species mentioned here. They are the biotic parts of the ecosystem. And the diversity of those species, for the time being, we will consider important for the provision of multiple ecosystem processes underlying multiple ecosystem services. But of course, ecosystems are also and these species, which constitute the biotic conditions, are important for ecosystem multifunctionality, and I'll give you just one example of that. This is derived from a garden experiment in Jena, a very famous experiment. And this is actually what you're looking at is the results of 20 years of painstaking observations. And what you see on the x-axis is plant species richness, and on the y-axis standardized process rates, meaning standardized between values between 0 and 1. And what you see is that with increasing plant species richness, we see an increasing delivery of the rate of ecosystem processes like pollination, decomposition, and pathogen resistance. However, the relationship between species richness and the multifunctionality of ecosystem processes is not always as straightforward as this. And this can be related to the environmental conditions in the ecosystem, which constitutes the abiotic conditions. And it's often the interplay between abiotic and biotic conditions that is important for understanding ecosystem processes. Now, what happens if the conditions of the ecosystem change? In terms of abiotic conditions, for example, think of a disaster, a load of contaminants in the water, or a disastrous flood, or a disaster in the biotic conditions, like in the case of invasive species. What then happens is that the original biotic community will change. And it will not change in a random way. It changes in a non-random way. And now I come to the central part of this figure, which talks about traits. Traits are fitness characteristics of organisms, like development time, mobility, body mass, and resource requirements. Now, depending on the stress that is put on the ecosystem, abiotic or biotic stress, some of those traits may be selectively affected and actually be wiped out from the community altogether or very much reduced in importance. Those traits we call response traits. The remaining traits, in as much as they are important for the multifunctionality of ecosystem processes, we then call effect traits. So often, the species diversity is not sufficient to understand ecosystem process multifunctionality. It is the diversity of traits and their variability that we need to consider to understand ecosystem process multifunctionality. I'll give you one example of this. This is from a study on litter macroinvertebrates. And what you see here, like earthworms and isopods and springtails, what you see here on the x-axis is mean functional trait dissimilarity. And I want you to keep in mind the term dissimilarity. What is expressed here is that the more difference there is in the traits, the faster ecosystem processes here on the y-axis are conducted. And the ecosystem processes mentioned here are soil respiration and leaf litter mass loss. Now this example and the previous one on plant species diversity, these results were obtained under fairly standard conditions. The garden experiment in Jena, and this is a microcosm experiment in the laboratory. And now I would like to return to the landscape level for further explaining what happens in terms of biodiversity. Consider this to be a landscape, an area of approximately 40 kilometers from left to right and a maximum of 30 from top to down. It's an area in the Netherlands, and I just selected it because it's the area where I was born. And you see a number of red dots in this map, and these are sampling sites for the soil fauna. The diversity at one particular sampling site is called the alpha diversity. The total diversity at the landscape level, so for all the sampling sites together, is called gamma diversity. And then there's this concept of beta diversity, which is 1 minus mean alpha over gamma. And this concept of beta diversity is going to be important, so keep listening. Here we have a stylized example of a regional species pool. Consider this to be in a landscape. The regional species pool is 12 species, so gamma is 12. And we consider 4 local communities, each with 4 species out of the regional species pool. And as you can see, there may be some overlap in species composition, but there are also differences. These are the species that are responsible for the ecosystem processes delivered. And I have circled here the term functions provided. And unfortunately, I have to dwell a little bit on the term function, because it is used in the literature as equivalent to ecosystem process, in other cases as equivalent to ecosystem service, and in many cases it is equivalent to both. And that causes a lot of confusion in the literature. But I can't help it. What is mentioned here in this paper is called functions, whereas in actuality it is more like ecosystem services. What are those services? Timber production, crop production, nutrient retention, and faunal diversity conservation. Now what you see here next to these boxes is flower diagrams. And some of the functions are marked in black and others are marked in gray. The multifunctionality, for example here at local community 1, is 2, meaning that 2 functions are above the 50% threshold of the observed maximum value in the landscape. And this is a common way of expressing which functions are considered quantitatively important and which are not. So the multifunctionality here is 2, here it's 2, here it's 1, and here it is 3. So here we have functions below the threshold. So the mean alpha is 4. So the beta diversity is 1 minus alpha over gamma, is 1 minus 4 over 12, is 0.67. If we look at the mean multifunctionality at the landscape scale, it is 2. It is the average of 2, 2, 1, and 3. And the total multifunctionality at the landscape level is 4. Now consider a major event happening, like the flood that I mentioned, or biological invasion, or a high contaminant load. What then happens is what the authors of this article call biotic-abiotic homogenization, which means that only species with certain traits survive, and those traits will determine ecosystem functioning. The species that are lost are indicated here by these arrows that bounce back. So as a result, we still have 4 species in each of those local communities, but the species here are no longer the same as the species there. And as a consequence of the homogenization, the regional species pool has gone down from 12 to 6. What we see is that some of the functions, the services that previously were above the threshold, compare this with this, are now below the threshold. And the other way around, formerly below the threshold, are now above the threshold. So there are changes in species composition, there are changes in trait composition, and there are changes in the main functions that are provided. Now, if you look at the mean local diversity, it is still 4, like it was here. The mean multifunctionality is still 2, like it was here. But the beta diversity has gone down. It's now 1 minus 4 over 6 instead of 4 over 12. So it has gone down to 0.33. And as you can see, the multifunctionality at the landscape scale is now down to 2 from originally 4. So the message of this paper is that beta diversity links species in the community and multiple ecosystem functions. I would like you to remember that the species that were gone after the homogenization were largely shrub and tree species. It is also the species that represent the highest biomass in the system. And I will come back to biomass as an important predictor of functionality in a moment. Yet another figure, taken from a publication on mechanisms determining spatial variation in energy fluxes of litter macroinvertebrate communities across landscapes. I selected this figure because different diversity measures that I dealt with are mentioned in it. The figure is about landscapes with a certain geographical distance, which go together with environmental distance, and an ecosystem process that is the energy flux. Indicated here as energy flux dissimilarity. The term dissimilarity should be familiar to you now as expressing the range of species or traits in a community. And what you're looking at is the results of a structural equation model. Structural equation modeling is a technique of network analysis that allows one to investigate whether the relationships between parameters are statistically significant or not. Now, what we see here is that beta diversity is significantly determined by geographical and environmental distance in the landscapes. What we also see is that beta diversity has knock-on effects on alpha diversity and on biomass. Interestingly, there is no direct relationship to energy flux, but the importance of beta diversity for energy flux goes through alpha diversity and through the biomass dissimilarity. Now you will recognize data diversity. I discussed this in the context of the species composition of the community, alpha diversity as being the species richness, and biomass I just mentioned in the previous graph as significantly reduced as a consequence of the particular example of homogenization. Now, interestingly, the other in diversity parameter that I measured relates to trait diversity and trait variability. And this box is isolated in this diagram, meaning that in this particular example, it was not explaining energy flux dissimilarity. Now, the authors of this paper don't discuss that in any detail, but I like to think that it has something to do with the scale of the study. Perhaps, but that's a hypothesis, this kind of diversity is apparent at smaller scales and overshadowed at larger scales. But there's no doubt that there is a multitude of studies in which trait variation and trait diversity is an important explanatory factor for ecosystem processes. So let me recap this. What we see is that in some cases, alpha or beta species diversity is important for multifunctionality. In other cases, it is trait diversity and variability, and in yet other cases, it's just biomass. And there's many studies in various areas of ecology in which biomass just explains the multifunctionality of ecosystem processes without the need to consider diversity. But I should also stress that there's many other examples in which this is not the case. I now move to the fourth subject, ecosystem services as a boundary concept. And here is this figure again, and here is ecosystem service multifunctionality. I now briefly return to the definition of multifunctionality, being the ability of ecosystems to simultaneously provide multiple ecosystem processes and services. And we can split this out. Ecosystem process multifunctionality, mentioned here, being the array of biological, geochemical, and physical processes that occur within an ecosystem. An ecosystem service multifunctionality as the co-supply of multiple ecosystem services relative to their human demand. And as you can see, I have put relative to their human demand in bold. Actually, it means that in a landscape, different actors or stakeholders, if you like, put value to different ecosystem services. For example, farmers will often consider yield as an ecosystem service very important. But nature conservation organization will put priority perhaps to farmland biodiversity. And the consequence of the different valuation of ecosystem services is that there may be conflict about the level at which they have to be delivered in a landscape, but it can also be the basis of negotiation among stakeholders. And that is why ecosystem services is called a boundary concept. In science, it may be difficult to handle that kind of concepts, but I'd like to see it as an asset, because as scientists we have to be able to make our work meaningful, and therefore we have to engage with stakeholders. This is also expressed in yet another figure taken from the literature. And what you see here, please concentrate on the bottom left part of the figure to begin with. The study is from, it's a study on weed control. And what you see here is a network, and the green nodes in the network are weed plants surrounded by pollinators, parasitoids, and herbivores. This is maybe the second time I mention the word network. Network analysis is thriving in ecology, and I just don't have the time to go into it. But network analysis is not just the prerogative of ecology. It also occurs in the social sciences. So what we see here is a social network reflecting the sensitivities to the ecology, in this case the weeds of this layer. The nodes here may include individual stakeholders who can vary in their perceptions, and the links may represent shared views on the conservation and cultural value of weeds and attitudes towards the use of herbicides. One layer up, we see economic networks associated with financial transactions for herbicide purchases or the costs of a pollinator conservation scheme accrued from the management of weeds. Now, the interesting thing is that in network analysis, it is increasingly possible to quantitatively link these ecological, social, and economic networks. So it's developing as a useful tool to support conflict management and negotiation. So, to wrap up, different actors perceive ecosystem service differently related to the socio-ecological and socio-economic circumstances and indeed to the political context. Hence, stakeholder interests can influence the feedbacks between ecosystem services and the management of complex ecosystems. This is made visual here. Here we have the socio-political context, and here we have the ecosystem services informing that context. And there's two extreme cases mentioned here. The left part versus the right part. In the left part, management decisions are aimed at high rates of application of pesticides and fertilizers and high soil disturbance. As a result, the networks that I just mentioned are fairly simple. In the other case, management decisions are aimed at the application of pesticides, fertilizers, and soil disturbance reduction. As a consequence, the networks that I was talking about are much more varied. Now, the important message of this figure is that management decisions that focus purely on one ecosystem service, such as crop yield, can limit the balance of ecosystem services provided by other species in complex food webs, for example, in terms of pollination and biological pest control. Now, I like to think that a common agricultural policy in Europe slowly but steadily is moving its focus from the left part of this diagram to the right part of it. And if that is the case, then EFSA may follow suit. And perhaps EFSA can actively support the common agricultural policy in the transformation that is happening, and that is, if you ask me, very necessary. Now, in whatever part of the diagram you position yourself, or you want to position yourself, engagement with stakeholders is necessary, but it also requires painstaking efforts. Whether you work within existing legislative frameworks to improve them, that's an area that I personally associate EFSA with most, or whether you are committed to fundamental alternatives to current land use practices like in regenerative agriculture. Your engagement will at the same time require unquestionable scientific independence in the co-creation of knowledge with stakeholders. Now finally, let me say a few words about the term elusive. I have called the links between biodiversity, multifunctionality and ecosystem services elusive. Elusive means difficult to track down, and that is indeed what they are. But the good part of my message is that they are not untractable. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the very complex, clear, and interesting talk. I would like to take some questions from the audience, if we have any. This is the classical way of discussion, and afterwards I would try to see if I have some questions via the app. If you... Please, yes?
Really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I can guess your answer to this, but I will ask it anyway. A lot of focus. Okay. A lot of focus on the ecosystem service in the policy domain is about putting financial values to the services. How does that fit in with the approach that you're presenting here?
So that's about the slide I had to drop. You know, there's this concept of supply-benefit relationships, which tells you that in different landscapes, the supply of ecosystem services can be different, right? And in different landscapes, you have different actors putting value on those ecosystem services. And it's the multiplication of the level at which ecosystem services are provided and the value of stakeholders that is often used to calculate the final valuation of a stakeholder group on the ecosystem services in a landscape. And obviously, if the actors, the stakeholders, are farmers on the one hand and nature conservation organizations on the other hand, you can predict that the more varied the landscape is, the more the valuation by the NGO, and the more simple the landscape is, the more the valuation by the farmers. But if you look at more ecosystem services, and if you consider more stakeholders, then the outcome of this calculation using supply-benefit rates is less predictable. So it's a useful tool.
audience, please? Okay. I don't see no hands from the audience. Then I will move to a question that I don't have. I think you still need it.
I'm not done yet.
The question is, can be functional diversity instead of species diversity a more appropriate diversity endpoint for environmental risk assessment?
Thank you. That's a difficult one, because I gave an example in which species diversity explained ecosystem process rates, and I gave examples in which it was trait diversity and trait variability. But in general, I think that trait diversity and trait variability are a more useful entry point for environmental risk assessment. But it differs between the cases, and it's for a reason that I presented both alpha diversity and beta diversity and trait diversity as explained in 3 factors for ecosystem functioning and underlying ecosystem services.
Do we have more questions? Also via the app? If not, we move to the next speaker. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm happy to welcome Wayne Munns, Director of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Atlantic Ecology Division, expert in the field of population modeling, ecosystem services, and ecological risk assessment. Your talk has the title, Opportunities for and Implication of Including Ecosystem Services in Risk Assessment and Risk Management of Regulator Stressors. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvia, and good morning, everyone. First, let me do a sound check, because sitting up in the front row, it's very difficult to hear the speaker. Is everybody okay with this? Okay. I'll try to speak clearly, and I will forewarn you that I'm still amazingly jet lagged. So I'll ask Sylvia to come up and poke me if my head kind of goes into the microphone. So I guess I drive this. If I could have my slides, please. I'm going to take a decidedly different tact than Liebert just presented. Talk about how we can work towards making the concept of ecosystem services fit for purpose in risk assessment and risk management. Maybe this is my opportunity to take a nap. There we go. So I want to start off with just a little bit of background before diving into the meat. And some of this is repetitive with the introduction that Sylvia gave. The concept of ecosystem services has been around for a while. It's still not fully inculcated into our analytics and our decision-making processes. In fact, the concept itself is much older than the past 20 years. First reference I could come up with is somewhere in the early 1900s when there was a discussion about the effects of birds in agricultural landscapes. So the concept's been around for a long time. It still has yet to work its way into decision making. So using that as sort of a springboard background, I want to provide a little bit of terminology that's going to differ from what we just heard and from some of the terminology we heard yesterday in plenary. Then I'll move to a framework for utilizing ecosystem services and risk assessment and risk management. And this builds off of the sort of now classic ecosystem service cascade that has various manifestations. I'll talk about the opportunities for applying ecosystem services to our advantage in decision making through using them in ecological risk assessment. Present a couple of recommendations regarding how ecosystem services can be incorporated in risk assessment and risk management. And then finally describe just a few of the actions that I see are needed to realize some of those benefits as we move forward. So some terminology. Let me start off by talking about ecological production functions. These are really the components of ecological and social systems that interact in ways that produce ultimately observable ecological outputs, where ecological outputs are biophysical features that are produced by ecosystems that require very little translation to make clear what their value is, what their benefits will be to people and society. When those outputs are valued, when there's demand for those outputs become ecosystem services. Ecosystem goods and services, often abbreviated ecosystem services. And it's often valuable to think of two different types of ecosystem services. One are final services, and those are things that are directly demanded by people and by society and produce direct benefit to people and society. The others are intermediate services, which don't provide that direct benefit or may not be directly demanded by people, but yet ultimately do contribute to social welfare. Often it's kind of difficult to separate these two concepts, and they're very contextual in the sense that an intermediate service in one context may be a final service in another context. For example, if we're concerned about blue crab production out of the Chesapeake Bay in North America, the final ecosystem service is blue crab abundance, whereas water quality might be an intermediate ecosystem service that leads to the production of those blue crabs. Yet if we're concerned about water quality, then water quality would be the final ecosystem good and service. Now let me offer an example of an ecological production function before I go on with some of the terminology. These can be displays or descriptions that are very linear, or they can be multi-dimensional and highly complex. This example is a multi-stressor ecological production function that Valerie prompted me to produce for a meeting last year in North America. I will point out that the color coding here, red are stressors, ultimately linked to human activity. The blue are features of the environment, and the green down in the lower right-hand corner is a final ecosystem good and service, which in this case, for this EPF, is observable divers. Now, if you're from North America, divers are common loons, but recognizing that we're in Europe, I'll call them divers. So a couple of things to note here. EPFs can reflect multiple stressors in the environment, some of which are directly regulated, some of which may be within the purview of EFSA. For example, the application of plant protective products can ultimately affect water quality, where in this case, water quality could be considered the stressor that derives from the plant protection products themselves as being stressors. And the impacts of these stressors can play out multiple ways in this complex, in this landscape of interactions. Ecological production functions are valuable to think about for a number of reasons in risk assessment, which I'll get to in a minute. But one important thing is they can identify points of management or intervention that ultimately can increase the amount of ecosystem service delivered through management action. Now, coming back to terminology for a minute, human well-being, in my sense, broadly described, is the condition of people and society in terms of a number of aspects. Basic material and other natural resource wealth, freedom of choice, health, the degree of social relationships and the quality of those relationships, personal security, and this list can go on and on. Ecosystem services can affect some of these directly, some of them indirectly. When taken in an aggregate level, human well-being is called social welfare or utility. So now we're starting to move into concepts of economics, referring back to the question that was asked earlier. And then finally, in this conceptualization, ecological benefits are the contributions to social welfare provided by ecosystem services. That term, ecological benefits, is kind of confusing. One might think of them as economic benefits or social benefits. In this case, they're benefits supplied to people by the environment, and so we call them ecological benefits. Now, those concepts can be put into a framework. This is that aforementioned ecosystem service cascade, which starts off in the upper left-hand corner with the ecosystem itself. So these are the biophysical and, I guess that's it, biophysical processes and components that are interacting in ways through ecological production functions to produce ecological outputs, which when we start to apply concepts of people's demand for those outputs and the availability of other similar outputs, can result ultimately in final ecosystem goods and services. Now, there's a concept of a social welfare function which addresses issues of scarcity, substitutability, and so on, ultimately resulting in a description of the ecological benefits supplied by changes in those final ecosystem goods and services. Now, ecological benefits can be quantified in a number of different ways. Economists would like to do it monetarily. There are non-monetary approaches which reflect values that society and people have in changes in ecosystem services, and some of those are based on economic theory. Those changes in ecological benefits should inform policy and risk management decisions, which in turn would come back to influence ecosystem services and ecological production functions. So putting that in more of a risk assessment, risk management context, we see that policies and decisions influence the amount and quality of stressors in the environment, which in turn influence the ecological systems and the ecological production functions, and so on down that cascade. And we can begin to talk about assessment endpoints in risk assessment that are based on ecosystem services. And I've shown them here in this lower blue box. This lower blue box, which are based in this sense on changes in final ecosystem goods and services, but could also be influenced by this concept of measures of effect or measurement endpoints, as they're sometimes called, which can be used as proxies for ecosystem service-based assessment endpoints. I also show in this other blue box where conventional assessment endpoints fit into the general risk assessment, risk management paradigm. That is, they typically they're typically measures, indicators of biophysical components of the environment, but do not necessarily reflect ecosystem services themselves. But in both cases, they can inform risk assessment and ultimately risk management. Now, what are some of the opportunities for bringing ecosystem services into risk assessment and risk management? Well, I've described these as potential benefits of doing so, but they reflect the opportunities that we will accrue if we do so. So one is that it should result in more comprehensive and consistent environmental protection. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is because of the concept of ecological production functions, which are really at the apex of a variety of components and interactions in ecosystems, changes in those final ecosystem goods and services reflect changes within that complex. So there's a broader consideration of environmental change than simply a singular assessment endpoint. Incorporating ecosystem services assessment endpoints will also allow for consideration of not only ecological and environmental aspects of a problem, but also the social aspects of a problem, because we're immediately linking that endpoint to both the environment and to society. And as a result, the decisions that are made in risk management and ultimately policy should be more fully informed and scientifically and societally defensible. Now, another aspect, and I see I've lost my numbering in this list, I'm sorry about that, is that incorporating ecosystem services in risk assessment and management should allow for more clear articulation of the benefits, costs, and trade-offs that are associated with selecting any given policy option or decision alternative over any others that are being considered. This can be accomplished by looking at the economic trade-offs that are involved with selecting one alternative over another, whether those trade-offs are monetized or not. And the gains and losses in ecosystem services can form the basis for communicating the rationale of selecting one alternative over another. There's my numbering back. Ecosystem services will probably also help to derive more operational and tractable protection goals. We know that quite often protection goals are cast broadly, such as biodiversity, maintenance of biodiversity. Those things can be very difficult to quantify, but when brought down to the level of specific ecosystem services that are linked to those higher protection goals, the risk assessment itself should be much more tractable. That's because it makes the assessment and the decision much more decision context than a broadly cast protection goal. Now, I'm not as familiar with how environmental quality standards are used in the EU, but in the United States, we have a process of identifying environmental criteria, which are essentially the thresholds below which we expect only acceptable environmental impacts or no environmental impacts. To base those criteria on ecosystem services will also accrue the same benefits that are described for deriving specific and tractable protection goals. This one is the one that's not often thought about, I think. Using ecosystem services should help us to be able to better integrate human health and ecological or environmental risks. The reason for this is ecosystem services can form a common currency, if you will, that links the two immediately. So it links the environment with people's well-being and, in many cases, human health. It will also help to facilitate integration of policies, regulations, and programs in a horizontal and vertical kind of manner, both through this concept of common currency. That'll help to encourage alignment of different programs by focusing on similar goals and may help to minimize the realization of unintended consequences as a result of different policy objectives. And then finally, it should help to communicate the results of decisions that are made and why assessments were conducted the way they were, because ecosystem services, if they're final services, should reflect human values directly, people's values directly. Now, a few recommendations for how to incorporate ecosystem services in risk assessment and management. And I've broken these down by the phases of risk assessment, at least how we see it in the United States. So for problem formulation, we would suggest that we select assessment endpoints based on either the EFSA approach, the 2010 EFSA approach, or through the approach developed in the US that's called the generic ecological assessment endpoints approach. Either way involves evaluation of the importance of ecosystem services to people in the selection of those assessment endpoints. We also argue, and we heard a lot about yesterday, that it's critical to have stakeholders' values reflected in that endpoint selection. That's a messy process. Quite often there are conflicting views, but that doesn't mean we can't have multiple assessment endpoints in risk assessment as well. But those opportunities and advantages that I referred to before all accrue by having those assessment endpoints reflect people's values. I would also argue that we should start to use standardized classification systems for ecosystem services and to put those in the context of ecological production functions, which will be the basis of conceptual models for planning the risk assessment itself. And just to digress for a minute, there are multiple standardized, there are multiple typologies for describing ecosystem services, most of which are good heuristics, few of which come up with a standardized accounting scheme that accounting scheme, I think, is going to be critical as we move forward. Very quickly, I'll just talk about two that have been developed recently in the United States. One is the National Ecosystem Services Classification Scheme that's based on the economic accounting schemes that are used in the U.S., and it incorporates aspects of both supply side and demand side use of goods and services. Now that results in a numeric accounting scheme, and I'll just refer you to this bottom box because it's most appropriate for the kinds of things that EFSA deals with. But ultimately what it comes up with by using a number of classes and subclasses is a code that's shown here in generic form that can be used to account for changes in those ecosystem services through time in either a national kind of setting or for a specific context. Now the other system is called the Final Ecosystem Goods and Services Classification System, which has many attributes similar to the Nexus system that I just described. It has a simpler coding in the end, but it does reflect both environmental components and how beneficiaries or people use those environmental components. Both of those systems focus on final ecosystem services to avoid the problem of double accounting in economic analysis. Coming back to the recommendations, in the analysis phase of risk assessment, that analysis should really focus on the ecological production functions to understand how different decision alternatives will ultimately influence the ecosystem services assessment endpoints. It can also be used to evaluate indirect ecological benefits and disbenefits. In risk characterization, the risk should be quantified in terms of those final ecosystem goods and services, and those should be amenable to valuation. And then I've already mentioned that for risk management and communication, those conceptualizations in ecological production functions can be key messaging devices. Just quickly, a few actions to realize the benefits. We need to start moving towards more rigid adaptation of ecosystem services and policies and protection goals. That will require development of procedural constructs and guidance for application of ecosystem services. A key component here is going to be education and outreach, and that includes focusing on risk assessors, risk managers, and key stakeholders in the public. There's still a lot of misconception out there. I think you'll see over the course of today that there are a lot of different interpretations of ecosystem services, and we need to start converging on a common set of understanding in order to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. We'll now have a period for questions, and I would like just to remind you, you have an app on your phones. You might like to use the apps and ask questions which will be considered and come through to either Sylvia or myself as we try and manage the question period. But first, I'll open it up. Any questions from the audience in the room, please? And if a microphone, could you just give your affiliation to start with? Name and affiliation, please. Thank you.
Yes, hello, my name is Tobias Frische from the German Environment Agency. Thanks for your talk. I would like to learn, you were telling that it's important to engage the stakeholders in the selection of ecosystem service endpoints. I would just like to learn how you do this in practice. So have you experiences? Who are the stakeholders? How you organize the process, just to learn how you do it?
Thank you for that question. I think there are a lot of different ways I could begin to answer that, but I'll try to do it in a very general sense. Usually risk assessments and risk management decisions are contextual. That is, there's a particular stressor or a particular component of the environment that we're trying to protect, and that will immediately begin to point to different classes, different groups of stakeholders that can and probably should be part of the conversation that influences the planning of the risk assessment process and should be the recipients of understanding why decisions are made the way they are. So if we take a plant protection product kind of example, just in a general way, we'd have a variety of different stakeholder groups, including farmers, including pesticide and herbicide manufacturers, perhaps including food consumers. There might be another group that represents NGOs who are particularly concerned about the outcome of environmental management actions. Now, I alluded to the fact that this is a very messy process, and so you can imagine trying to put all those different stakeholder groups, once identified, into a room to have a conversation. There's going to be a plurality of opinions offered. There's a growing concept called translational science. I think in the EU it might be this PPI that we heard about yesterday. I think there's a lot of similarities, which really encourages that active engagement of stakeholders throughout the entire cycle of planning through decision making, or in the specific case of research, which is where translational research and science have been developed. It's to engage stakeholders to understand what they need and how that product that is produced can be best utilized. I think a lot of those concepts are applicable to working with stakeholders to really understand what their concerns are. From a risk assessment standpoint, the key objective is to use that dialogue, that conversation, to identify which assessment endpoints are the most appropriate to include in the assessment. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much. Another question? I see Les has got the microphone, and then there's a question in front of you.
Yeah, Les Furbank from the EFSA GMO panel. We've heard in the previous talk that ecosystem services are essentially a network. And so is there not a risk that individual stresses may not affect the measured outcome, but rather the resilience of that outcome, and increase the chances that something else may cause harm?
I think I understand your question to be, what happens if we select the wrong assessment endpoint? Is that correct? If that's correct, then one of the recommendations that I would make is that you never conduct a risk assessment based solely on one assessment endpoint. And in fact, as we move more towards including ecosystem service-based assessment endpoints in our risk assessments, we should also include the conventional assessment endpoints that might be selected based on characteristics, attributes such as their perceived or known susceptibility to the stressor being evaluated, in addition to their importance to other components within an ecosystem, which may ultimately affect an ecosystem service. So I think regardless of whether we're talking about ecosystem services or conventional assessment endpoints in risk assessment and management, that risk, pardon the use of that term, will always be there, that we're not identifying the correct things to look at. Does that help?
Thank you very much. Can I have a quick question, and then I want to take one question from the app, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. So please, introduce yourself. No?
I'll try to be loud. My name is Sevi Hadzopoulou from Roskilde University in Denmark, and I'm a political scientist. So I would like to ask you, how do you ensure and balance the differences between the stakeholders' different views, you mentioned already there are a lot of them, with the risk assessment objective science-based opinion? So how does this affect the other? And in Europe, we have separate bodies that do the risk assessment and the risk management. How do you think this is affecting the whole process? Because in the US, it's actually one body. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess with respect to the first part of your question, I'm not sure what the right adjective is. If I want to be extreme in this, I would say that the science component that historically has influenced selection of assessment endpoints and risk assessment should be minimized. against, well, when compared to the values of stakeholders. And I use the term stakeholders to be very broad, to include the policymakers and decision makers. So I think one of the problems that we've had with risk assessment historically is that the things that have been identified as assessment endpoints are meaningful to scientists, but perhaps to nobody else. And so I'll just offer an example. Scientists may recognize that the benthic infauna in Roskilde Fjord are important to the ecology of the fjord. And yet the people of Roskilde, and maybe Denmark as a whole, might not appreciate that at all. So decisions that are made based on whether there's an impact or not, a risk or not, to benthic infauna will be meaningless to society in general, even though the scientists may understand it completely. And in between those two steps, those two extremes, the scientists and broad society, are the policymakers and decision makers kind of caught in the middle. And if they can't communicate why they selected the options, the alternatives they did based on the risk assessment, then they're not really being effective at doing what they're supposed to be doing, in my mind. Now, could you repeat really quickly your second part of your question? We were talking about that a little bit before the session, and I think both in the EU and in the United States, but in different time frames, there were precipitating events that called for separation of previously much more closely interacting risk assessment and risk management processes. I can speak to what happened in the US. There was the concern that politicians were messing around with science. There's also that concern today, by the way. But as a result, one of our primary advisory bodies to the US government on the science side recommended that complete separation of the two, with the exception of communication of needs and outcomes between the two. But I think there's been a concerted movement away from that. I know as early as the early 2000s, when looking at the problem of integrating human health and ecological or environmental risk assessment, a group of us in the World Health Organization were actually recommending that those two components be brought back together. Because part of the problem is if risk managers and policymakers aren't part of the conversation about what a risk assessment should be, the outcomes of that risk assessment will be less than valuable.
Thank you very much. I think we've actually lost time to deal with the question that I've got on the app, so maybe we can hold that and come back to that at the end of it. Okay? So thank you very much indeed. And I'd now like to introduce the next speaker, who's Professor Valerie Forbes, who is Dean of the College of Biological Sciences at the University of Minnesota in the States. And before that, she was University of Nebraska-Lincoln and spent some 20 years at Roskilde in Denmark. Her research is basically across the quantitative ecology and environmental management, with particular focus on population ecology and modeling, fate and effects of toxic chemicals in aquatic systems, and ecological risk assessment. She is extremely well qualified to give this talk, which we look forward to, challenges in applying the ecosystem services framework to risk assessments of regulated stressors. Valerie, all yours.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you very much to EFSA for inviting me to come here and speak and be part of this fascinating conversation. I'm delighted to be here, and hopefully you can see me over the podium, but you know, I'm here. Okay, so one of the challenges we have in doing ecological risk assessment is that we tend to measure stuff like this, but that's not really what we care about. We care about stuff like this. And how can we make these linkages between what we normally measure in our risk assessments and what we really care about as a society? And we have lots of methods to do this. Some are fairly primitive, if you will, and some are a bit more complicated. But as we develop new technologies, and I think some of the recent developments in molecular biology leading to the generation of huge amounts of data at even lower levels of biological organization, provide even more challenges for us, because we can generate huge quantities of data, but what do those data mean in terms of the things we want to protect? And since we're even further from our protection goals, potentially we add more uncertainty into those extrapolations. So I think this is a real issue. Way back, I'm embarrassed to say, about a decade ago, EFSA developed an opinion on using ecosystem services to translate the general protection goals from the legislation into what we called specific protection goals. And I was part of the group that developed this opinion. We sort of summarized it in a shorter version, which was published in Science of the Total Environment in 2012. And I think this was really an important step, and EFSA showed really key leadership in trying to bring together what it is society cares about and our way of typically doing risk assessment for pesticides. And so basically, and I suspect many of you in this room are familiar with what we did, but basically we started with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment document and looked at all the ecosystem services that potentially could be affected by pesticides. And then we tried to identify, okay, what are the key drivers of those ecosystem services, which taxa or functional groups were providing those services, and then we went from there sort of backwards to try to define over what spatial and temporal scales and other dimensions of these service providing units, if you will. And so we kind of worked backwards from what was defined as ecosystem services in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report to actually what we're measuring in our typical ecological risk assessments. That was the process. And it was a very helpful exercise to go through to try to see if how we're doing risk assessment is capturing all of the key ecosystem services that we might care about. So what did this actually do for ecological risk assessment, this exercise? Well, it did help to facilitate the use of better extrapolation models and help to integrate fate and effects assessments better. It has been used in some limited cases to generate trigger values for bees, which we could discuss maybe later. But it didn't really change the way we do risk assessment. It's not changed which species are tested and what endpoints we measure in those species. And for me, one of the most important issues is that we're still not making quantitative mechanistic links between our typical ecological risk assessment endpoints and ecosystem service delivery. And this is kind of what I want to talk about today. There are a lot of challenges with using ecosystem services as risk assessment endpoints. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on 3. As I mentioned earlier, our risk assessment endpoints are moving further away from the things that we want to protect, and this can potentially add uncertainty or provide opportunities if we can develop quantitative and mechanistic models that can help us make those linkages across levels of biological organization. I think our first speaker showed a really great example of how impacts on service providing units, whether they be individual species, groups of species, functional traits, how the relationships between those service providing units and service delivery are not necessarily linear, right? There are feedbacks, there are complications, context matters. So it's not sufficient just to use proxies. That's not going to get us where we want to go in terms of being able to assess service delivery. And importantly, we don't have what I would call standardized conceptual models to link our test endpoints to ecosystem service delivery. And that's maybe the next step that we have to go to in order to make this system operational. So how would we make, everybody likes ecosystem services, right? It sounds good. It's a way of framing our protection goals in words that a lot of people other than scientists can understand and appreciate. And so in that sense, the use of this concept has resonated among a lot of people. But we can't just articulate what we're already doing and call it something else, right? If we really want to change the way we're doing our risk assessments to make them based on better science. So if we wanted to do this in a way that was really scientifically robust, we would start with, okay, let's say we've got our usual test endpoints. Death is a common one that we measure. Let's say for the sake of argument that we're looking at bees. So we have our typical dose response or concentration response relationship where we expose our critters to different concentrations of a chemical and more die, right? That's the thing that we usually measure. But dead bees are not the same as pollination. Okay, so somehow we have to get from our typical endpoint to delivery of the service. Well, the next step would be B, as it were. Come on. Okay, it doesn't want to go there. Can someone help? There we go. Okay, so the next step would obviously be to relate that bee mortality to something about the populations. And in this case, I've just called it bee population dynamics. It might be population size over time. It could be another endpoint. And so a number of us have been developing what we call mechanistic effect models that will help us link our toxicity test endpoints to some attribute of a service providing unit, in this case, colonies of bees. But we're not done yet because we've still got proxies. The next step, there we go, would be to then relate the properties of the bee populations to service delivery, which in this example would be pollination. And I think in all of these cases, as I've shown here, these relationships are potentially very nonlinear, which is why it's not sufficient to use proxies. My definition of an ecological production function differs slightly from Wayne's, but I don't think we should get hung up on that. My point here is that we need something that can mechanistically and quantitatively link properties of our service providing units, in this case bees, to delivery of the service, which is pollination. And that's where I think we've really got a lot of work to do. So one of the initiatives that I've been involved with since moving back to the States is to try to develop some quantitative models that can help us link the impacts of chemicals across levels of biological organization. And there was an opportunity to get some work funded by the National Institute of Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, it's an NSF-funded institute that brings together biologists and mathematicians to solve different problems at the interface of the two disciplines. So we put together a workshop of about 40 people that involved not only mathematicians and biologists, but people from multiple sectors, industry, government, and academics, and held a workshop in 2014. This led to the subsequent creation of two working groups. I would have liked to have one, but they limit you to 12 people per working group, and there was a lot to cover across all of our levels of organization. So we ended up doing two working groups, what we called the Molecules to Organisms working group and the Organisms to Ecosystems working group. And the idea with these, and NIMBUS doesn't fund the research, they fund people to get together over the course of about 2 years and solve different problems at the interface of the disciplines. So our goals with these two working groups were to looking across the levels of biological organization with a particular emphasis on risk assessment, to figure out how we could develop models that would help us link mechanistically across levels in a quantitative way. Now, I've drawn this as a very neat series of boxes connected by straight arrows, and in full disclosure, we know that these relationships are super messy and very nonlinear and not at all as neat as this. But for the sake of argument, since we were forced to divide ourselves into groups of 2, the aim was to meet at the level of the organism, which is where most of our toxicity test endpoints are today. So we thought that was a reasonable place to meet. And for various reasons, which I could talk to any of you who are interested about later, we decided to use dynamic energy budget theory as kind of a pivot point to link from the adverse outcome pathways that would connect our molecular responses to individual organism properties, and then individual organism properties up to delivery of ecosystem services. So we had 4 meetings over the course of a couple of years, and a couple times both groups met together to try to develop kind of a conceptual framework for how to do this work. So basically, one aim was to develop a general framework to mechanistically link these levels. We decided to use a case study approach to actually provide proof of concept and see if this framework could do the job. We also wanted to identify key gaps in our understanding and in data, and there are a lot of gaps, I can tell you. And so I'm going to mostly be talking about our group, which was the Organisms to Ecosystem Services group, but obviously we wanted to make sure we tightly integrated with the Molecules to Organisms group. That turned out to be more challenging than we would have liked. And finally, to develop recommendations for research and how to go forward implementing this framework. We developed 2 case studies. One was our habitat was a mountain stream, where we chose 2 ecosystem services for this case. One was catchable fish, like by anglers or recreational fishermen, and the other was the presence of fish, because the state of Colorado has a state fish, which is the greenback cutthroat trout, and people care about fish. And so that's an ecosystem service that we wanted to be able to use in this case study. Our stressor in this case was ethanyl estradiol, or EE2, which is a hormone-active substance. The reason we chose this was really because our sister group, the Molecules to Organisms group, had a lot of mechanistic information. Some quantitative AOPs have been developed for this substance in fish, so we thought it was a good opportunity to integrate. Because of the limitations in the funding, we didn't have the funds to develop a new model, so we decided to use an existing individual-based model called InStream, which has been well-tested and was developed by Steve Railsback and Brett Harvey. Our second case considered a Midwest reservoir, where here our ecosystem services were catchable fish again for recreational purposes, but also clear water for swimming and boating and viewing. In this case, we considered an insecticide and tried to do the case study with a sort of hypothetical organophosphorus insecticide because we had a lot of data that we could use for the case. And again, we used an existing model, multi-species model developed by the US EPA called Aquatox. And this helped us to work through, in a very concrete way, what our conceptual framework would look like. And I'm just going to show you the framework rather than going into the specific details of these cases, again, but I'd be happy to talk to any of you about this at a later time. So here are the key elements of our conceptual framework, and I think there are a couple important features about this. One, we have our different levels of biological organization. Depending on the risk assessment, we may or may not have data at these different levels. We also often have data here. If we've done higher tier risk assessments, we may have some data up here. Increasingly, we may have data at the suborganismal level. We also have tools that can help us to link across these levels, whether it's dynamic energy budgets or other kind of energy budget models, all different kinds of population models, food web or ecosystem models. I think a key point here is we still, once we have the output of our, if you will, ecological models, we still need to relate these to ecosystem services, whether they be intermediate or final. And this is, I think, where we're really in need of some additional mechanistic modeling. It's often, sometimes your ecosystem services are delivered by a population of a given species. And in one of our case studies, the fish, it was very simple because for fishermen, having an abundance of catchable fish is the service that they care about, and that's the output essentially of your population model. But in other services, obviously, and has already been discussed this morning, it's much more complicated. And so we can't just use proxies that are the outputs of our ecological models. We need additional models that help us link our ecology to service delivery. And I think very important, as sort of Wayne was getting at, relating to the human beneficiaries. We really have to have a demand for an ecological output and someone who cares about it in order for it to be an ecosystem service. And then we can, I won't be talking about ways to value ecosystem services. There are people here who are much more knowledgeable about that than I am. But this is basically a kind of framework to help us think about these relationships in a way that we can then go in and make these relationships quantitative and mechanistic, which, if we want to do a better job of risk assessment, I think is what we have to do. We published the overall framework from our group in 2017. Our in-stream case study is just out online in Science of the Total Environment. And the second case study with the Midwest Reservoir is currently in prep and ready to be submitted any moment. So if anybody's interested in the details, you can get those here. Where do we go from here to address some of the remaining challenges? I think we need a standard protocol for model design. And if you think about all of the work that we do with standardized toxicity tests, right? We have all of these international standards that everyone accepts. So if you have a risk assessor who's looking at a dossier, if they look and see, well, it's a Daphnia number 202 reproduction or whatever test, they know what it is. They know what the acceptability criteria are. There's not a lot of work that they need to do in order to be able to evaluate the results of that test. This is not the case with the models. And what we see and have seen is that every time any kind of mechanistic model is provided, usually at a higher tier risk assessment, holes get poked in it from all over the place because there are no widely accepted criteria for model acceptance and evaluation. So I think this is where we need to go next. I think what we see also is that in practice, the models today are developed kind of ad hoc, usually by a single modeler or a group of modelers from a single sector, and really to I think, gain acceptance, we need more of a multi-stakeholder collaboration. And I think of development of the focus scenarios as maybe one way one could go about this. And we need to be able to improve the efficiency, consistency, and transparency in both the model development and in their implementation. I think we do have some black box issues remaining, and quite understandably, risk assessors are hesitant to use tools that aren't completely understandable. There's been a lot of development, opinions by EFSA in recent years on good modeling practice. There's been a lot of work as part of a EU initial training network called CREAM. That was from 2009, I think, to 2013, that developed good standards for good modeling practice, model documentation. But on the model development piece, we still have some work to do. So I've been working together with Amelie Schmolke to develop a process by which a modeler would document the model development process. So the idea is that somebody who wanted to develop a mechanistic model, in this case a population model for plants, would be guided through a step-by-step process, answering a series of questions, so that if you had 5 different modelers going through this, the idea is they should all come out with a pretty similar conceptual model at the end of the exercise. And I've had the pleasure of spending the last 10 days in Germany at UFZ, working with my good colleague Volker Grimm, together with Amelie Schmolke and my postdoc Chiara Colla, to try to take this further and develop some, figure out how we could develop a process to get a standard series of conceptual models that we could use in the risk assessment process. And I'd love to tell anybody who's interested more about that and get your feedback. So, in conclusion, I think for the ecosystem services framework to be to measurably improve the way that we do ecological risk assessments, it has to be more than just a descriptive framework, which at this point it largely is, which is an important first step. We have to have the concepts down before we could put the modeling behind it, but I think now's the time to move to the next steps. We need, therefore, more and better models that can predict ecosystem services delivery from impacts on whatever the service providing units are, and impacts on service providing units, which frankly are rarely the test species that we use in risk assessment, right? But we have to make links from those from our test endpoints to the service providing units, and that's another area where modeling can help. And finally, I think we need more consistency and transparency in the models, and I'll say less expert judgment. And I want to clarify this. I don't mean that we don't need experts. That would put me out of a job pretty quickly. I may have a conflict of interest there, but I declare it. What I mean is, I think we need to be able to articulate that expert judgment so that we don't put 5 people in a closed room and have them come out and say the answer's 10. Because that is doing a disservice to the work that we do. And I think we can and should do a much better job of articulating that expert judgment in the interest of better transparency, better reproducibility, and better communication of our risk assessments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for a very interesting talk, also for the framework of the case studies and showing us some way forward. I would like to take some questions from the audience. There we have one.
Thank you. My name is Martin Dermien from the NGO Pesticide Action Network Europe. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. We have a problem with models in the way that they are conceptual and they're not perfect. And very often, for instance, you mentioned the focus model that predicts environmental concentrations for pesticides. That is not in line with what is found in the environment in the end. So you mentioned the development of new models for ecosystem services. What about feedback mechanisms based on environmental monitoring that, in our view, are very important and should lead to very quick readjustments in the models, which we don't observe for the moment? Thank you.
Yes, I absolutely agree. That's a very important point. So in case anybody couldn't hear it, the question is about using monitoring data or field data to sort of evaluate the model outputs and kind of improve the models. We need both, and I do not want to imply that we just go off and do our modeling and forget about the data. I think ideally, in a perfect world, we're in an iterative process, right, where we use the data to better inform the models and the modeling to better inform what data we need. And I think that's a really, really important point. And I think you might have been talking about exposure or fate models for pesticides, which has kind of always been interesting to me that we seem to accept using fate models in the risk assessment process, or at least a lot of people do. But on the effect side, not so much. And I don't know why, but hopefully we can get there.
We have another question here, please.
Tobias Frische, German Environment Agency. Again, I have a question with your examples you were showing. You had each time one stressor, as far as I understood. You had one stressor. Sorry? Now you got it? Okay. Well, in your case studies, you had one stressor, chemical stressor, but in real world, it's like that. We have a lot of stressors. I would like to learn how you cope with this.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. In this diagram that I showed you in our case studies, yes, we had one chemical stressor, but in the actual case studies, we had also a lot of other environmental stressors to address things that way. But you're absolutely right. I think in the field we all know, right? Typically you have a cocktail of chemicals that organisms are exposed to in addition to all those environmental stressors that are out there from whatever causes. And if you ask me, I think that's an even greater reason why we're going to need the modeling, because there's absolutely no way we can test this stuff at relevant spatial temporal scales empirically. Just can't be done. Whereas some of these models, particularly the more complicated ones, yes, they take a lot of effort to develop and validate and all that stuff. But once you have them, running different scenarios is much less expensive than, say, and cost effective than if you wanted to run another field study or another mesocosm study. So I think for exactly the reason you point out that we have multiple stressors is why we need to have more and better models that we all kind of agree on and have consensus on that, you know, they're okay. So thanks.
Can I have on the screen one question from the app, please? Because I think it's the question that follows what you said. From a fate modeler, do you think that models will be accepted for use in environmental risk assessment in the future, or even in the near future? Okay.
I hope so. I think so. I think there's been a lot of progress. And again, I'm talking about ecological models or effect models. And I think that we have seen a lot of progress since the early 2000s. There have been a number of initiatives, largely in Europe, it must be said, to incorporate modeling, effect modeling, ecological modeling into the risk assessment process. And I think as we recognize that we need a more holistic approach, that there are multiple stressors, that we want to be looking at things on more relevant spatial temporal scales, and we want to be looking at ecosystem services, not just dead fish and beakers, that yes, we're going to need the modeling, and I think that's becoming recognized. But we need a process to get there, and a process that's much more efficient than what we have at present. And that's why my plea for a standard set of models that can be agreed upon by the different stakeholder groups. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed again. We have now a coffee break that will last till 10:30. It's a little bit shorter than planned, but we'll reconvene here at 10:30. Thank you very much.